The snow did not fall, it attacked. It came sideways, a hard, white grain driven by a wind that had teeth. It scoured the girl's skin where the rags had torn away, turning her flesh a blotchy, prayer book red. She was tied to the hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a barren patch of mud now hidden under a churning sheet of white. Her feet, bare and blue, were lost in the accumulating drift. She did not shiver. The cold had moved past that, had gone deep inside her and settled in her bones, a block of ice where her marrow should have been. She kept her eyes on a point just beyond the town, on a line of skeletal cottonwoods that clawed at the gray, unforgiving sky. To look at the faces in the small crowd was to invite a different kind of cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. They watched her from the cover of the general store's porch, their forms blurred by the gale. Men in thick coats, shoulders hunched. A few women, shawls pulled tight, their whispers snatched away by the wind but their judgment as clear as glass. They were a Greek chorus of murmurs and sideways glances. They saw a piece of human driftwood, a problem left for the tide, and they wanted it to wash away. A man named Finch had put her there. He was a bluff, red-faced man who smelled of sour whiskey and self-importance. He had won her in a card game 2 towns over, or so the story went. He had paraded her like a new mare, then found her wanting. Too thin. Too quiet. A bad omen. So he had tied her to the post at dawn, a public discarding. Let the next fool have her, he had boomed to the saloon keeper, his voice slick with contempt, before riding out with his men, leaving her as a monument to his displeasure. The crowd had gathered slowly. First the curious, then the pious, then the cruel. Someone had laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Another had spit a brown stream of tobacco juice that stained the snow near her feet. She did not flinch. She had learned that stillness was a kind of armor. If you did not move, did not cry out, did not plead, sometimes the beast would lose interest and wander away. She had carried whole winters inside her long before this blizzard began. The day bled away into a bruised twilight. The wind turned meaner, howling down the single street, rattling the windows of the clapboard buildings. The crowd thinned, driven inside by the storm's mounting fury, until only the most stubborn or the most heartless remained. The world was shrinking to the post, the rope, and the screaming white. She felt a strange sort of peace settle over her, the resignation of a thing about to break. Then, a shape detached itself from the shadows of the livery stable. A man walking into the teeth of the wind as if it were a mild spring breeze. He was tall and thin as a fence rail, wrapped in a long, worn duster that whipped around his legs. He did not look at the remaining gawkers on the porch. His eyes were fixed on her. He stopped a few feet away, his face obscured by the low brim of his hat in the swirling snow. He just stood there, a silent observer joining the scene late. The men on the porch shifted, muttering to one another. They knew him. Silas. Lived alone out on the ridge. A man who had buried his wife and child years ago and had been burying himself a little more each day since. Silas's gaze was heavy. It was not pitying, not leering. It was a weighing, a measuring. He looked at the frayed rope digging into her wrists, at the ice clinging to the hem of her thin dress, at the raw skin of her ankles. He carried whole winters in his eyes, too, she could see that even from a distance. A landscape as bleak as the one around them. He took a step closer. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He was not a man who wasted motion or words. He looked from her to the last of the onlookers, his expression unreadable. One of them, a portly man with a proprietary air, stepped forward. She's Finch's leavings, Silas. Best let her be. More trouble than she's worth. Silas didn't answer him. His attention returned to the girl. For the first time, she met his gaze directly. She saw no savior in his eyes, no hero. She saw something quieter, something more real. She saw a deep and abiding tiredness that mirrored her own. Then he spoke, his voice low and raspy, yet it cut through the wind's shriek. I'll take her. The words hung in the air, simple and final. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The man on the porch sputtered. Take her? On what grounds? Finch. Finch is gone, Silas said, his voice flat. He reached into a pocket of his duster and pulled out a few coins, worn smooth with use. He tossed them onto the porch. They landed with a dull clink on the boards. That settles his account for the rope. It was not a purchase. It was a dismissal. An erasure of a debt she had never owed. He turned his back on them, a finality in the gesture that brooked no argument. He walked the final few steps to the post. He drew a small, well-used pocket knife. The blade clicked open, a sharp, clean sound in the muffled world of snow. He did not say a word to her. He simply reached out and sawed through the coarse rope at her wrists. The fibers parted with a weary sigh. The sudden release of tension was a shock. Her arms, locked in place for hours, fell uselessly to her sides. Sensation, sharp and agonizing as 1,000 needles, flooded back into her hands. She swayed, the world tilting. He caught her, not with an embrace, but by gripping her upper arm. His touch was firm, impersonal, a simple act of leverage to keep her upright. His hand was rough, calloused, but there was a steady warmth that seeped through her thin sleeve, the first real warmth she had felt all day. He cut the rope at her ankles, his movements efficient and sure. She was free, but her legs wouldn't obey. They were frozen stumps. Without a word, he bent down, hooked one arm under her knees and the other around her back, and lifted her. She was shockingly light, like a bundle of dry sticks. She tensed, expecting roughness, a reminder of her station as an object to be moved. But his hold was just practical. Secure. He pulled the flap of his duster over her as best he could and turned toward the edge of town, away from the feeble lights, into the heart of the storm. The wind howled its outrage, but his steps were steady, sure-footed. She closed her eyes, her head resting against the rough wool of his coat. It smelled of snow, wood smoke, and a deep, earthen loneliness. The steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her ear was the only sound that mattered. It was the sound of a world narrowing to a single, stubborn act of transit. The journey was a blur of white and gray. The blizzard was a living thing, a predator that swallowed the path, the trees, the very air. But Silas moved through it with the grim determination of a man long acquainted with hardship. He did not speak. The wind would have stolen the words anyway. Silence was the language of this landscape, and he was fluent in it. She drifted in and out of a shallow, shivering consciousness. At one point, she felt him adjust his grip, pulling her closer against his chest to shield her from a particularly vicious gust. It was not a gesture of affection. It was practical, an act of preservation, like shielding a struggling ember with a cupped hand. Still, a flicker of something long dormant stirred within her. The simple, physical fact of being shielded. After an eternity of struggling footsteps and the monotonous roar of the wind, the terrain began to rise. They were climbing. The air thinned, grew even colder. Then, through the swirling chaos, a shape emerged. A small cabin hunkered down against the slope of a ridge, looking less like it was built on the land than born from it. A curl of smoke, pale against the white, rose stubbornly from its stone chimney. The door opened with a groan of weathered wood. He carried her inside and gently set her down on a braided rug before a stone hearth. The sudden warmth of the room was a physical blow. It hurt. Pain, sharp and electric, shot through her feet and hands as they began to thaw. She gasped, curling into herself on the floor. Section, he didn't hover. He moved to the hearth, stirred the glowing coals, and added a few logs. Flames licked up, casting flickering amber light across the single room. The space was spare, stripped to its essentials. A narrow bed in one corner, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding a few tin plates and mugs. It was a place of solitude, haunted by a deep, quiet absence. An empty chair by the fire seemed to hold the shape of someone who was no longer there. He ladled water from a bucket into a pot and set it near the fire. Then he turned to her. "You hurt." His voice was low, careful. She couldn't speak. She shook her head, a small, jerky motion. The pain in her limbs was a roaring fire, but she knew what he meant. He was asking about a different kind of hurt. He seemed to understand. He disappeared for a moment into a shadowed corner and returned with a thick, woolen blanket. He laid it over her, his movements still careful, his hands never touching her directly. He took a clean rag, dipped it in the warming water, and wrung it out. He knelt and gently, methodically, began to wipe the grime and ice from her feet. His touch was clinical, detached, yet profoundly kind. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was treating a wound, nothing more. But no one had touched her with such care in a lifetime. She watched his cracked, capable hands as they tended to her, and a single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. He did not look up, did not acknowledge it, a courtesy for which she was grateful. When he was done, he moved her, lifting her again, this time placing her in the chair that was not empty, the one by the fire. He wrapped the blanket more securely around her. He handed her a tin mug of warm, weak tea. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold it. He steadied her hands with his own for a moment, his grip firm and impersonal until the trembling subsided. He established the rules of this new world without a single command. He ladled a thin stew into a bowl and placed it on the small table. He sat in the other chair, leaving the fire between them, and ate his own portion. Food was offered. Warmth was given. He did not ask her name. He did not ask her story. He simply created a space for her to exist in. When the meal was over, he took the bowls to the dry sink. He gestured to the hearthrug where he had first set her down. A second blanket and a small, flat pillow were now there. A bed. It was close to the fire in the warmest part of the room. His own bed was across the cabin, shrouded in shadow. He went to the door, and for a terrifying second she thought he would lock it. The fear was a cold spike in her gut. But he only checked that it was latched against the storm. The bolt remained undrawn. "I don't lock doors," he said, his back to her. It was a promise. He retreated to his own cot and lay down, fully clothed, pulling a blanket over himself. Soon, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the unabated scream of the wind outside. The cabin was a small, fragile ark in a sea of white. She lay on the hearth, wrapped in wool, the strange, aching warmth spreading through her body. She was not a possession here. She was not a problem. She was just a presence. And in the deep, profound silence of this man's home, she felt the first, tentative beat of a life she thought had ended. The blizzard broke in the night. Dawn arrived pale and exhausted, revealing a world sculpted in white. The silence was immense, a heavy blanket laid over the land. In this new quiet, a new rhythm began. The days that followed were measured not in hours, but in tasks. Silas rose before the sun, his movements economical and quiet. He would stoke the fire, pull on his boots, and head out to sea to the small lean-to that served as a barn. The sound of his axe splitting would become a steady heartbeat to the morning, a rhythm of survival. She, in turn, found her own work. At first, she merely existed, a ghost by the fire, watching him. But the inertia of victimhood began to feel heavier than labor. One morning, while he was outside, she found a worn broom in the corner. The floorboards were rough, but she swept them clean of ash and tracked in snow. It was a small act, almost meaningless, but it was hers. When Silas returned, he glanced at the swept floor, a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, maybe, and then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. A routine bloomed in the silence. He worked outside, she worked inside. She learned the cabin's quiet sounds, the specific creak of the floorboard near the door, the sigh of the logs settling in the fire, the way the wind hummed a different tune when it came from the north. She found a sewing kit in a small wooden box, his late wife's, she presumed. The needles were fine, the thread neatly wound. She began mending his worn shirts, her stitches small and even. She mended the blanket she slept under. She was stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a fabric of shared space. He communicated in gestures. A log left on the hearth for her to add to the fire. A pail of fresh water placed by the sink. One afternoon, he came in from the cold, his hands raw. He worked at the table, fixing a piece of leather harness, his fingers clumsy with cold. She heated water and poured it into a basin, placing it on the table beside him. She said nothing. He stopped his work, looked at the steaming water, then at her. He submerged his hands, a low sigh escaping his lips. A conversation had taken place, profound and complete, without a single word. One day she ventured outside. The air was sharp as glass. The snow was deep, sculpted by the wind into waves and dunes. Not far from the cabin, under a lone, stoic pine, was a small mound of stones. A grave. 2 graves, one large, one small beside it. There were no markers, but she knew. This was the source of the quiet that filled the cabin, the source of the winter in his eyes. She found a single, tight pine cone, its scales perfect, and placed it on the larger mound. It was a small offering to the ghosts who shared their home. He saw her do it from the barn doorway. He didn't speak of it when he came inside, but that evening the stew he made was thicker, with more meat. He left a half-eaten loaf of her bread on the table. It was a little dry. He had not complained about hers. She had baked it 2 days prior, her first attempt in years. It had come out dense and hard. He had eaten 2 slices without a change in his expression. Sharing food became their primary form of dialogue. His stews, her slowly improving bread. Each meal was a quiet affirmation. We are still here. We have survived another day. The community, such as it was, did not entirely forget them. One afternoon, a man on horseback appeared. Mr. Jensen from the next valley over. He was nosy, his eyes darting around the cabin, lingering on her. Heard you took on that stray finch left, Jensen said, his voice oozing a false familiarity. Got yourself some help, Silas? Silas, who had been sharpening an axe head, did not stop his work. The rasp of stone on steel was the only reply for a long moment. Then he looked up, his eyes flat and cold. "She has a place here. Folks are talking," Jensen pressed on, ignoring the warning. "Say it ain't proper." "Let them talk," Silas said, his voice dropping lower. "They got nothing better to do." "You need something, Jensen, or are you just here to measure my morals?" The question was sharp enough to draw blood. Jensen flinched, his bluster deflating. "Just passing by. Seein' if you survived the storm." He tipped his hat awkwardly toward her and rode off, the dust lifting behind his horse like a guilty ghost. She had stood by the hearth through the entire exchange, her hands clenched in the fabric of her mended dress. He had not defended his own honor. He had defended her place. He had drawn a line in the dirt around her, around them. The thaw deepened, not just in the landscape, but in the small cabin. One night, the old fears came for her. In her sleep, she was back at the post, the rope tight, the laughter of the crowd like stones thrown at her. She cried out, a thin, strangled sound, and woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was dark, save for the embers glowing in the hearth. A shape moved from the far corner. Silas. He came and sat in his chair by the fire, not looking at her, simply being present. He stoked the fire, bringing a soft light back to the room, chasing the worst of the shadows away. He sat there for a long time, his silhouette a bulwark against the night. The silence was different from their daytime quiet. This was a waiting silence, an open silence. Finally, her breathing evened out. Her heart slowed its frantic pace. She found her voice a threadbare thing. "Don't lock me in." He turned his head slightly, his profile etched by the firelight. "I told you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't lock doors." Another long pause. She needed to know. She had to ask the question that had been sitting like a stone in her chest since the day he cut her down. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you take me?" He stared into the flames for what felt like an age, as if the answer were written in the shifting coals. "The wind was turning mean," he said at last, his voice sounding like it came from under floorboards. "And no one else was moving. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a truth. It was enough." He had not seen a stray to be claimed or a woman to be had. He had seen a creature caught in a storm, and he had stepped into the wind. She lay back down, pulling the woolen blanket up to her chin. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. For the first time in a very long time, she felt the ground beneath her was solid. She fell asleep again, this time to the steady sound of his breathing across the room. A quiet rhythm that promised she was not alone in the dark. Spring arrived hesitantly, in trickles of meltwater and the shy green of new grass pushing through the muddy snow. The sun had a little more warmth to it each day, and the land itself seemed to be taking a long, slow breath. The quiet routine of the cabin had become a comfort, a predictable shape to their days that felt like safety. But the world beyond their ridge had not forgotten them. The harbinger came not as a letter or a rumor, but as a shape on the horizon. A man on a fine-looking horse, riding not from the direction of the town, but from the east. He rode with an arrogance that announced itself from a distance, his posture straight, his pace unhurried. He was not a neighbor. Silas saw him first. He was splitting the last of the winter logs, the axe falling in a steady rhythm. He stopped mid-swing, the axe held motionless in the air. He stood perfectly still, watching the rider approach. Attention entered the air, tightening around the small cabin, pulling the newfound piece thin as a wire. She was hanging mended clothes on a line stretched between two pines. She saw Silas freeze and followed his gaze. Her heart gave a hard, painful jolt. Even from this distance, she knew. She knew the entitled set of the shoulders, the confident cant of the hat. Finch. She felt the old cold seep back into her bones, the icy resignation she had worn like a second skin. Her first instinct was to run, to hide in the cabin, to become invisible. But she looked at Silas, standing there like a statue carved from granite and grief, and she stayed. To run would be to undo every swept floor, every mended shirt, every shared, silent meal. It would be to say that this place was not hers, that his defense of her had meant nothing. Finch rode right up to the edge of the cleared yard, stopping his horse just short of the woodpile. He surveyed the scene with a proprietary smirk. He looked at the cabin, the curl of smoke from the chimney, the line of clean laundry. His eyes settled on her and his smirk widened. It was the look of a man appraising livestock. Well, Finch boomed, his voice as loud and unwelcome as it was in her memory. Look what the storm washed up. I heard you'd taken in my lost property, Silas. Came to collect. Silas lowered the axe slowly, deliberately, and leaned it against the chopping block. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his movements calm, measured. He walked to stand between Finch and the cabin. Between Finch and her. She's not property, Finch, Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Finch's boom sound hollow. And she's not lost. Finch laughed, a short, ugly bark. I won her fair and square. Had a run of bad luck and had to leave her behind for a spell, that's all. The deal was for a girl to settle a debt. This one will have to do. I've come to take what's mine. He shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on the pommel as if preparing to dismount and take her by force. The land became a battleground. This small patch of earth which they had coaxed back to life with their quiet labor was now the stage for a final claim. Finch's argument was one of ownership of a world where people could be items on a ledger. Silas's was older, rooted in the simple decency of shelter and shared bread. That deal's done, Silas said, his gaze unwavering. You left her tied to a post in a blizzard. Whatever claim you think you had, you left it there to die with her. The law says, Finch began, his face reddening with anger. The law ain't up here on this ridge, Silas cut him off. Up here, there's just what's right. And you ain't right. Finch's eyes narrowed. He was a man accustomed to getting his way through bluster and implied threat. He was not used to being met with such unyielding, quiet opposition. He looked past Silas at her. Girl, get your things. You're leaving with me. It was a command. The kind of command she had spent her life obeying. Every muscle in her body screamed to comply, to make herself small, to avoid the violence that was sure to follow. She took a half-step back, her foot catching on a loose stone. But then she saw Silas's back. He hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched. He stood there, a thin, lonely barrier against the world, and he was not yielding. He was holding his ground for her. The wind was turning mean, he had said, and no one else was moving. Now he was moving. He was standing. A new feeling, hot and fierce, uncoiled in her chest. It was anger. An emotion so long buried she had forgotten its name. It burned away the last of the fear. She bent down and her hand closed around a piece of firewood, a stout length of oak, heavy and solid in her palm. She stood up straight, her chin lifting. Finch saw the movement, saw the weapon in her hand. His eyes widened in disbelief. He had expected a cowering stray, not this. She found her voice again. It was not the whisper from the dark cabin. It was clear and steady, and it rang with a strength she didn't know she possessed. No. The word was a stone thrown. It hung in the air, absolute. It was a declaration of self. A drawing of a border. It said, you do not own me. You do not define me. You do not cross this line. Finch was stunned into silence. He looked from her defiant face to Silas's immovable calm. He was one man and they were two. Not two people, but a single, unified front. He saw no fear in them, only a deep, unshakable resolve. He was a bully, and the thing bullies fear most is the absence of fear in their victims. He pulled at his collar, his bravado crumbling into dust. You're a fool, Silas. He spat, trying to salvage a shred of his authority. She'll bring you nothing but trouble. She's already brought the spring, Silas replied, his voice still quiet. The simplicity of the statement disarmed Finch completely. There was no arguing with it. He yanked on his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it snorted in protest. He cast one last, hateful glare at them both. You'll regret this. He spurred his horse and galloped away, his retreat as hurried and graceless as his arrival had been arrogant. They watched until he was just a speck disappearing over the rise. The tension broke. The air rushed back into her lungs. The piece of firewood suddenly felt immensely heavy, and she let it drop to the ground with a soft thud. Her legs were trembling, but she was still standing. Silas turned to face her. His expression was impossible to read, but his eyes, those haunted winter eyes, held a new light. It looked like pride. You all right? He asked, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. She could only nod, a wave of feeling so powerful it stole her breath. She had not been rescued. She had stood her ground. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a creature he had sheltered, but as the woman who had stood with him. I never asked your name, he said, the words a quiet admission. She looked at the cabin, at the laundry line, at the grave under the pine tree. She had been called many things in her life, none of them her own. Girl. Stray. Property. She had no name to give him that wasn't tarnished by another's claim. I don't have one, she said, her voice soft but sure. Not one that fits anymore. Silas considered this for a long moment. He looked toward the new green shoots pushing through the earth, toward the warming sky. Lena, he said. The name was simple, clean. It sounded like light. Lena, he said again, testing it. It suits you. Lena. She tried the name on in the quiet of her mind. It felt like the first warm ray of sun after a long winter. It felt like her own. A name given not in ownership, but in witness. It was the first brick of a new foundation. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the quiet of two solitary people sharing a space. It was the settled, comfortable silence of a shared victory, a shared home. After the meal, Lena did something she had only imagined. She took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one she had washed and kept folded in a corner. She walked to the hearth and, without ceremony, she laid it on the burning logs. They watched together as the flames consumed it. The fabric blackened, curled, and then erupted into a bright, consuming fire. It was the uniform of her old life, the emblem of her suffering, and it was turning into ash and memory. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting. When it was gone, Silas rose and went to a large wooden chest in the corner, one she had never seen him open. He lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender and cedar filled the air. He reached inside and pulled out a simple dress of dark blue wool and another of soft, faded calico. They were his wife's. He laid them on the table. It was not a gesture of replacement. His eyes told her that. It was a practical offering. A gesture of continuity. These are just clothes, he said, his voice low. They've been waiting for a purpose. She reached out and touched the sleeve of the blue dress. The wool was soft, well cared for. It was a gift of immense trust. An opening of a locked room in his heart. She looked at him, and her nod was all the answer he needed. She was accepting not just the clothes, but the future they implied. She was stepping out of the ash, and he was meeting her there. Weeks turned into months. Spring deepened into a lush, green summer. Lena's name settled into her as if it had been hers all along. She filled the cabin with the small touches of life. Wildflowers in a tin can on the windowsill. The smell of fresh bread, no longer hard and dense, but light and warm. She even planted a small garden with seeds Silas had found in town, coaxing lettuce and radishes from the dark, rich earth. The grave under the pine tree no longer felt like a place of sorrow alone. She and Silas sometimes sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun set behind the ridge, and the grave was just a part of the landscape of their life, a testament to what had been, not a shadow over what was becoming. The house, which had once felt hollow and haunted, now seemed to breathe with them. It was a home. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of blood orange and violet, they sat in their usual comfortable silence on the porch steps. A warm breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwoods. I was scared that day, Lena said quietly, her voice no longer thin, but full. When Finch came, Silas, who was carving a piece of wood into the shape of a small bird, did not stop his work. I know, he said. So was I. It was a confession, a gift of vulnerability that was worth more than 1,000 declarations of love. He was admitting that she was not the only one who had had something to lose. You didn't run, he added, his knife making a delicate shaving curl from the wood. Neither did you, she replied. He finished his carving and held it out to her. It was a small, simple wren, its head tilted as if listening. It was beautifully, tenderly made. She took it, its smooth, warm surface fitting perfectly in the palm of her hand. He looked at her then, his gaze clear and steady, the long winter in his eyes finally over. There was no grand pronouncement, no promise made in haste. There was only the quiet truth of two broken people who had stood together in a storm and found, in the wreckage, a place to rebuild. They had stitched their lives together with unspoken kindness, with shared bread, with a name given and received. They had found their home not in a place, but in each other. And as the first stars pricked the deep blue of the sky, that was more than enough. This story, it isn't just about a man rescuing a woman from a blizzard. It's not about a hero and a damsel. It's about the quiet, stubborn power of decency in a world that has forgotten it. It's about how the deepest wounds are not always healed by grand gestures, but by the steady, patient rhythm of a shared life. By a swept floor, a warm meal, a door left unlocked. It's about the fact that a home isn't always four walls and a roof. Sometimes a home is the safe space you find in another person's quiet care. It's the feeling of being seen for who you are, not for what you've been through. It's the moment you realize you can stand your ground because someone is standing right there with you. Every one of us has a name we were given and a name we earned through our choices. So here's your naming. It's a reminder that even when you feel tied to a post, discarded by the world, there is a strength in you that is yours alone. And if you're brave enough to claim it, brave enough to say no to the ghosts of your past, you might just find that someone is willing to step into the wind with you. You might find that the fire only changes everything if something new and something true is waiting in the ash.